Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining. My name's Oli Pinson-Roxburgh. I'm the Managing Director at Bulletproof, and I'm going to be taking you through this webinar. We're going to be talking about the Bulletproof Annual Cybersecurity Report for 2019. But before we get into the data, let's have a quick look at the agenda for today's webinar. To start with, I'm going to go through an introduction into Bulletproof. So we're going to look at where our data comes from to give you a good idea of where the information that we're presenting within this report and also within this webinar is coming from. We're going to look at the threat landscape, and we're going to look at general trends for 2018, so what we saw in 2018 within our data set. And the data set we're going to focus on is really the penetration testing information. We're going to look at social engineering and what we've been doing to test organizations' security posture. We're going to look at the proactive monitoring side of things as well, where we're going to investigate what we've been looking at in our customers' environments, so what attackers have been doing to target our customers and what we are doing to help prevent those and predict or observe those attacks before they become a problem. And then we're going to look at the predictions for 2019, and we're going to also look at some conclusions towards the end. So what does Bulletproof do, and where does our data come from? So we do a number of different things, but the data is really coming, as I mentioned earlier in the agenda, or previously in the last slide in the agenda, it's really coming from our penetration testing data, our proactive monitoring services, so threat management, which is where we're ingesting lots of log data and security events. We're raising those to the customers to help them to identify threats as early as possible. And we're also going to be looking at the pen testing data, which is of course where we are actually testing people's security infrastructure, looking at their applications, the configuration of their systems, and then we're going to touch on the social engineering side. There are some data sets that come from things like vulnerability scanning. We're going to talk about common vulnerabilities that we've seen over a few years and see how they've changed and over time. And of course, there's some compliance data in there where we're going to give you some advice on how to remediate some of these findings. Let's start by looking at the notable breaches for 2018. There were some very large breaches over 2018, and of course we're not here to talk about the specifics of any of these. Just to note that in a lot of the cases there was techniques used, common techniques we see over and over again, and some of those we see in this what we're going to talk about in this report. But a lot of it leads to the loss of customer data and loss of information that could, in theory, lead to attacker being able to monetize that data, maybe credit card data or things like user data, where they can use that against the individuals where their data is lost. And that's of course where, which has really brought about the importance of GDPR and data protection. I'm going to talk in a bit more detail actually about how the attackers are using some of these larger data sets later on in the presentation. But just to note, we have seen some fairly serious breaches still again in 2018. So let's touch on the general trends. First and foremost, what we've been seeing as an organisation is a general drop in ransomware. There's been some big cases in the NHS, and there has been some slight increases in the release of new ransomware towards the end of 2018, early 2019. But in reality, the majority of the ways in which the attackers are trying to monetize their attack is through things like cryptocurrency mining. We saw an increase in that over 2018, where we started to see the attackers malware that they were creating, including features such as cryptocurrency. We also saw some new techniques in cryptocurrency mining where the attackers are starting to use browser technology, so things like JavaScript, to start to mine cryptocurrency during their attacks. So they're essentially using web applications, they're maybe exploiting them, and then are deploying JavaScript code, which then exploits the browsers themselves. And then all the time that you're browsing these websites, the attackers are making money through cryptocurrency mining. The thing about the approaches the attackers take with regards to cryptocurrency mining really leads to how profitable that mining activity is. So for example, if they're using techniques such as JavaScript, where they're getting a browser to mine, the actual amount of cryptocurrency and mining over a period of time is not very large. It's quite small. But if you think about very opportunistic attacks where attacking lots of systems, they can actually make quite a bit of money if they have a huge pool of systems where they're very heavily browsed websites, or they've just got lots of websites they've hacked and they've deployed this JavaScript to. So in some cases, you read articles and they talk about the profitability of cryptocurrency mining and it being quite low if the attackers are doing it. But of course, there are also other ways in which we're seeing attackers compromising systems, such as trying to compromise container technologies and to try and utilize big compute resources to spin up lots of servers and get them mining all at once with the same malware over and over again. So it's the different stories will suggest different things. In some cases, it may seem like actually why are they doing it, because it's not going to be worth that much money. In other cases, we've seen examples of where the attackers are actually raising almost $280,000 a month in just cryptocurrency mining alone. We've also seen an initial rise in fileless malware, where essentially what that means is that the attackers are trying to find new and innovative ways to get around security controls that we're putting in place. And so ordinarily the malware would install some form of files onto the operating system as a way to, of course, utilize the features on the operating system, grab software, make command and control connections home to a central server to send data to. A lot of the times they're having to use files with scripts and whatever else running on those systems to be able to enable the tools to work. But now we're seeing attackers using other approaches where they're installing a lot of functions within the software, within the malware, into memory, which makes it more difficult for the tools and technologies that are trying to detect this malware, antivirus vendors, so they're essentially trying to make it very difficult to detect that malware, and trying to find also ways to obfuscate the code and of course make it more challenging for us as organizations to protect ourselves. Now, when I mentioned before, we look at these big data breaches, and of course, yes, it makes the press and it makes for very scary news. But what we're also seeing is that this high-profile breaches, these big data leaks, they're leaking hundreds of millions of customer details. And in actual fact, we found databases of usernames and credentials with big data breaches into the billions of records. And now the attackers are getting smart. They're starting to use that data. And I'm going to talk about that in this presentation as we go through. But let's start by looking at penetration testing data. It's always interesting to look at organizations' security from the view of the attacker. And of course, in many cases, that's exactly what we're trying to simulate when we're doing penetration testing. And the data is really interesting because these are organizations that are investing in doing penetration tests. They've got money to spend. They've obviously implemented a number of security controls already. They're conscious of security. And so it's interesting to see how they approach security. And what we've seen is that over 50% of the results that within our tests represent actually a very significant risk to a business. So much so that 1 in 5 vulnerabilities were deemed serious enough that we had to contact the organizations themselves and help them to address those issues immediately because of the impact that it had on the security of the applications they had out on the internet exposed to anybody that's connected to the internet. You can see that anything that's medium up through to critical would be something that would be high risk to an organization, and of course are the types of things that we would be communicating to organizations as to needing remediation almost immediately. Typical attack approaches really haven't changed. We're seeing very similar attacks. We're going to talk about that on the next slide. We're going to talk about the specific details of that. But really over the last 10, 15 years, we've seen a lot of the same attacks over and over again. And the attackers are not needing to really invent reinvent the wheel really a huge amount. They are, of course, improving their ability to get around security controls. They're having to adapt, but the overall method of which they're attacking systems is very similar or the same. And security, we're now seeing, really is being pushed out to the perimeter again. A few years ago, the approach was to look more at the inside of an organization because the attackers felt, or you could see that the attackers were trying different approaches to attacking organizations because the perimeter was pretty well secured. You had firewalls in place, you had intrusion prevention systems. In some cases, we started to see people using more and more application firewall technologies. And so the attackers looked to change their approach and try and target more of the internal systems. Now that we're moving systems out into third-party data center providers like cloud providers or private and also public cloud deployments, the attackers are now changing their approach again and then returning to the perimeter, which means that we are having to look as organizations back at our perimeter protection. What are we doing to protect those assets that sit there out on the internet? How are we going to solve that challenge? And I'll try and cover that as we go through. presentation. The other key thing here is that applications are becoming easier to produce. We're using more and more libraries, we're using more and more APIs to build our applications, which means that whenever we're building these systems, we're repeating the same approaches that we have done previously and reusing a lot of the code and, like I say, reusing third-party libraries and other technologies like plugins that have been provided by a third party. And that's leading to a greater risk for us as businesses because we lose a certain amount of control, whereas previously we used to spend a lot of time building our own applications and thinking about how we secure them or not, as the case may be. But the application developers themselves had control over that code. Now that we're moving out to more of a third-party approach where we're using other people's libraries and other people's software, we start to relinquish some of that control. And also because we're moving out into a lot of the cloud providers, in some cases we also are relinquishing some of the control over how we deploy these technologies and also our skills and expertise in being able to deploy those technologies. So what did we see? So firstly, what we noticed was that in our data set, there was a huge proportion of the vulnerabilities that we looked at were down to out-of-date, unpatched, or unsupported components. So we were seeing that organizations are generally still struggling to address the patching problem. How do I keep my systems up to date? How do I maintain those systems? This was second only to cross-site scripting, cross-site scripting was second to the second down on our list outside of the out-of-date systems and software and patching. Cross-site scripting is an interesting one, which we're going to talk about on the next slide, because it's one of those things that often gets pushed down the priority order, and I'll talk about why that may be. But that presented about 6% of our data. The next large data set was we found a fair amount of, or a huge amount of systems that were still using default or poor passwords. So this is more on the infrastructure side, where you may have systems that are running with default configurations. We haven't really thought about how to harden those systems out of the box using the standard configuration, and it led to organizations that we were testing actually using very poor password policies, which is why also it's very important to think about that big data set that I talked about earlier, where we're seeing these big breaches. If you've got users that are using we're not enforcing those users to use strong passwords, and they continue to use the same passwords over and over again, there's a good chance they're using the same passwords on things like their LinkedIn accounts that may have been compromised, as well as they're using those same passwords for their business accounts. And that, of course, becomes concerning as we start to push more and more systems out into the cloud that are always accessible out to the public. The other one on the list here is SQL injection. It's still there. It's still up there on the list. It's not as large as many of the other reports that I read. It's still 4%, so it's still something to note. And of course, out of all the other vulnerabilities we saw within the applications, these are of course the top 4 things that we've identified. So SQL injection is still of concern. And again, it's one of those things that it's quite worrying because SQL injection has been around for so long. We've really understood it. There's been some very serious breaches over the years where the attackers have used SQL injection, yet we're still struggling to solve that problem as part of the software development lifecycle, but maybe not as prominent this year in our report as outdated software. So what I thought I'd do is give you an example of a cross-site scripting attack, because I think it's useful to understand why we still see it as a priority, and we are often seeing them in our reports, in our testing. The way the attacker generally uses a cross-site scripting attack is also in combination with some form of social engineering. So I could guess that's maybe why it gets pushed down the priority order, because the attacker needs to do something more than just, of course, running a piece of script on an application that's compromised. They have to actually still get somebody to click a link or do something with that vulnerability in order to benefit from it. So what the attacker does is they take the link that they found on the website that has cross-site scripting in it, and in this case, what the attacker does is puts it into an email. He then sends it over to the user of the system. The user then clicks that link, and the reason why they would click it is because it would look very legitimate. And of course, it would look like you're going to the website. It may have appended a load of what looks like special characters and all sorts of other random bits of code, and often that's obfuscated as well. But to the general user, if they hover over the link, they might see that it looks a bit weird, but they will see the domain and the original website of your websites themselves, and the URL of the website, so it would look relatively legit. The user's browser would then load the legitimate site, but it would also load the code from the cross-site scripting attack, which would then lead to the attacker often trying to get things like cookie data or get data that will allow them to impersonate a user and then, of course, log in as that eventual user. Now, the other thing you could argue is that a lot of the browsers that we're using today actually have controls to stop cross-site scripting from working. But here lies the big debate, really. Do we worry about that because the browsers can block it, or do we focus on protecting those systems still and patching those systems that we're using? My advice is always to not rely on security controls, because if one of those controls fails, like the browser security control that stopped those cross-site scripting from working, or the user turned it off for whatever reason, or they've lowered their security level on their browser, or they're using an out-of-date browser, there's a good chance that the attackers will be successful and they'll get those users to actually click those links. And we'll talk about that in a moment around the social engineering exercise. How often are users clicking those links and what's happening when they do click them? So I guess more importantly, why are we seeing out-of-date software in this day and age when systems have been around for many years now? We've had lots of applications and they seem to still be growing. Of course, users expect us, or customers of ours and our users expect to be using web applications these days. They don't want to be installing software. They expect to be using mobile applications in a lot of cases. So why do we still have this issue of out-of-date software, and why have we not been able to fix this when we've known about updating systems for many, many years? Well, the first is that a lot of organizations these days are moving to a model where their approach to building applications and the way that they provide those applications longer term are actually quite agile. These systems are becoming more complex. They're using more functions. When they're moving it to the cloud, of course, systems are becoming ephemeral. They're taking on the functionality of these cloud providers, which means that actually updating these systems becomes a little bit more complicated as to how do we update them when they may be running into containers, or it may be that they're running in these complex PaaS environments, which is more of a platform provided by some third party. And then where does our responsibility lie, and where does the third party lie? Now, you could argue, of course, that if you are moving something into the cloud, in actual fact, if you're doing it in the right way, this agility allows you to actually, and scalability allows you to actually do these patches a lot easier, because you don't have to worry about downtime and outages, because the cloud environment should scale, enabling you to update just certain parts of your application, not all those parts at the same time, still providing you some functionality during this period of time. Often there's resourcing issues. So if you've got a small team that have got lots of different jobs to do, sometimes that slows us down from having to do the patches. There's potentially this fear of downtime. So if you have got applications which are mission critical, even if they are in the cloud, in often cases I've seen, when you've moved them into cloud environments, you haven't necessarily built them for the cloud, and so you still have to take them down for whatever reason to patch these systems. And so, of course, there's always that case of when is the best time to bring these systems down, and often there isn't a good time. We have this reliance on a third party. So if we're going to have to patch these systems, how do we get those patches, and how often can we rely on that third party to patch it? If it's a vulnerability they aren't aware of yet, and we've identified it as an organization, and we tell the third party there's a vulnerability there, how long before they actually go and implement a patch? And of course, how long before we then get access to that patch to resolve those issues? Sometimes with business critical software, we have this challenge where we have to run those systems out of date. It may only work on out-of-date software, and so in which case we cannot make those changes. They're not supported anymore. They may be end of life, and there isn't any more versions of software for us to patch on those systems. So we might know there's a vulnerability there, but we can't patch it. And a good example of that is of course XP, Windows XP. Some systems are still using Windows XP because they're mission critical applications, and you can't patch them. They're no longer supported. So things like the NHS and of course financial services organizations, they often are in a situation where those mission critical systems cannot come down, and we can't patch them either. So sometimes we just can't patch systems. And sometimes, of course, patching gets lost amongst the day-to-day activities. We just don't have the time to be able to do it, and we've got lots of other more pressing things that are going on. And I guess you could argue that some organisations see it as it may not ever happen to me, so why should I bother doing my patches right now? I've got other bigger pressing priorities to try and fix. So, how much of a problem can this be? Well, if we look at the data, you can see that in 2017, there was a drastic increase in vulnerabilities. I'm going to try and address why we think that is. But in 2016 to 2017, there was a huge increase in vulnerabilities. 2018, there wasn't quite that many additional vulnerabilities detected over the year, but there was still a fairly significant growth in over 1,000 additional CVEs. Now, these are the ones that we know of. There are, of course, many other vulnerabilities out there that haven't been found yet. And of course, there are also, I'm sure, vulnerabilities out there that some pretty smart attackers have already identified and may be using to their benefits without us knowing about them. So there's a lot for us to kind of get through, and that's how do we keep on top of which ones are relevant to us? How do we maintain a list of a knowledge of when the new vulnerabilities are out, which ones do we patch, how often do we patch them? Also, I guess the question is, are we enabling auto patching, and do we really want to be enabling auto patching for our critical servers? What do we know? Do we know what the impact could be if a server just suddenly updates and reboots and then comes back online? Could it bring down our systems? It's always a bit of a risk. So keeping on top of those vulnerabilities is going to be very difficult. Now, what we think happened, or what we've seen within the vulnerability data, should I say, is that a large rise in those additional vulnerabilities really came down to cheap Internet of Things devices. There was a big increase in interesting devices, internet-connected fridges. We started using more and more devices that required an internet connection, like IP cameras or doorbells that allowed us to connect to our home to review those systems. And of course, when they first came out, a lot of those devices were coming out off the back of a real need, and they just built them very fast. And so at that stage, they weren't really building them with security in mind. Now, why do we really care about that in the business world? Well, in a lot of cases, those cheap devices started finding their ways into business environments and networks. We also found that, of course, more business relevant Internet of Things devices started being released, and again they were pushed out fairly quickly because, of course, everybody else was already providing services, and so those vendors tried to keep up with the competition, and they started releasing technologies as well, again not really thinking about the security implications of how do we protect these devices, and how do we protect them on scale. Because now we've got thousands and thousands of internet connected devices out there, even millions, and so how do we protect these devices, and how do we look to secure them, and how do we code them securely from the very beginning? Now, of course, if the attackers are struggling to get past all these other security controls, these perimeter devices, they start to target the next path of least resistance, which is often the end user. So when we look at social engineering campaigns, we at Bulletproof we've sent thousands of phishing emails over 2018, over the year, testing people's security. And what we found is, out of those systems, we compromised hundreds of credentials. So what we found is we had a very similar, we saw a very similar pattern to what the attackers would see, is that over 69% of those emails that we sent were actually unopened. And of course, the success rate on these things really relies on, are people there at the time in which we send the emails? Are we getting the right email addresses? Are they too busy to review the emails? You really don't know what the situation could be when you go into these organizations testing the security. And the same is true of the attackers. They just send blanket emails and they hope that somebody's going to click it. 23% opened them but didn't do anything with them, and then out of those out of the whole emails, all of the emails that we sent out, 7% not only did they open it, they also sent credentials over to our testers, which enabled us, of course, to then log into their email boxes in most cases. And from an attacker's point of view, that's where they can then go to the next stage. It's a pivot point. It's an entry into the system that enables them to then try and compromise the network, try and target other users, maybe target people of more senior roles within the business, or if they already have permissions, start to use those permissions to our advantage. 1% only opened those systems but didn't send any credentials, or we didn't get any credentials from those systems when they tried to when we tried to execute them. But they may have clicked links, they may have taken them to the next stage, but didn't open or didn't enter any credentials into the system. But really, you don't need a lot of people to click those emails to use these social engineering techniques and actually make some success out of the attack. And phishing really is the easiest way to bypass a lot of your existing security controls, of course, because in many cases, okay, you may have email filtering solutions, but in a lot of cases, when we're building these emails and we're building these phishing campaigns, they look very, very genuine. And I'm going to show you what they look like on the next page to give you a bit of an example. And of course, remember, a small percentage of a large number is still a lot. So we don't need huge amounts of people to click these links and to follow the phishing campaign and to fall foul to social engineering. We only need really 1 or 2 people, or even just 1 person really, for these campaigns to be successful. So let's look at how it looks from the end user's point of view. It will look very genuine, even to the point where we are using techniques that allow us to make them look secure. So you have HTTPS and secure web URLs, links, websites. The actual formatting will look exactly the same, like in this case, as an Outlook web access portal. And to the user's untrained eye, it'll be very difficult to spot a social engineering campaign, and especially a phishing campaign. So what are the things to look out for? Check the URL. Often what we are doing in our techniques, which we're replicating what the attackers do, the URL will be slightly incorrect. So we'll be doing things like typo squatting, where we'll be buying a domain which has looks very, very similar to your own URL as an organization. So make sure that if you're using security technologies to have the ability to look for similar email email domains, and also websites to your own. So if you see users clicking a website and it looks very much like yours, but in actual fact the domain name is slightly wrong, there's a good chance they're being phished. Get your users to ask themselves a question: is this email expected? If you don't often ask users to reset their passwords and everybody suddenly gets a password reset, don't be afraid to ask the question, is this the right thing? Is this thing is something that is not malicious? We should be asking ourselves the question, this could be a malicious campaign, especially as everybody else is seeing it. Maybe I should ask somebody. And especially would your administrators ordinarily communicate with you in this fashion? Do they normally send you an email saying, hey, go reset your password or give me your credentials? It's very unlikely. Or go click this link. Of course, don't forget that phishing campaigns are generally looking very, very genuine, so it's very difficult to detect. But again, ask yourself the question, is this happening on a regular basis? And also, are more than a few people in your organization receiving these requests? Because if they are, then there's a good chance that it's a broad phishing campaign. Always treat requests for credentials, password resets with suspicion. Because there's a good chance somebody's trying to get you to reset your password and then log in as you in your legitimate website. In some of these cases, also when you're going through these campaigns, the attackers are actually redirecting you to your actual website. So the first failure will look like you failed your password, and then the second one will actually redirect you to your real website where you'll log in into your genuine user with your genuine credentials into your real website, and it will look as if you've just had a slight blip in your credentials where you failed once, and it'll look a bit strange. But the reality is that time the attacker might have stolen those credentials. And when in doubt, check with the sender. If somebody sent you an email, you're not sure about it, just contact them directly and say, hey, just this email, can you just confirm I've got to go reset my password? What do I need to be doing here? Why am I doing this? So that kind of brings us on to the next stage of our presentation quite nicely. It starts to look at what do we need to be looking for in our organizations to detect some of these attacks, because the attackers go through a number of different stages, from reconnaissance all the way through to exploitation of systems, and of course performing the operation at the end, something called the kill chain. So how do we monitor these systems, and how do we make sure we are ahead of the game and we know what's going on? When you're looking at events and you're categorizing in events, we help organizations to, of course, investigate their event data. What we do is we put them into a certain set of categories. First being warnings. That's really that attackers are always poking around in people's environments. They're always doing things like scanning systems, doing a bit of reconnaissance. We don't want to be really flagging these events all the time because it could cause things like alert fatigue. So warnings are all about knowing that there's something strange going on, but really just flagging them so that they can be something that can be investigated at a later stage, or maybe we do take some proactive actions, but not they won't be prioritized as a high level of risk. False positives are important. I'm going to talk about why false positives are important in the moment. Action taken is really the key one. Is if you see something that looks like it's a bit dodgy and you need to do something about it. You need to react to those events, but it's really how do you understand those? And I'm going to talk about how to prioritize events and how to look into events in a moment. Open events, of course, is something that is ongoing. You can't expect there to be just an alert flag up, you go and deal with it and everything goes away. There's always going to be a case where you need to keep events open to continue to monitor those incidents as they go, because things change over time. Attackers are used to the kind of slow game these days. They're often not doing this kind of smash and grab approach which we've seen over many years. They're taking more stealthy approach, especially in the areas of ransomware. They'll try to stay in your environment for as long as possible without you noticing them being there. So you're often going to see events that will be open for a fairly significant time. And then, of course, the last is a security incident. Those are the things that are really, really high profile. There'll be a phone call. There'll be an immediate need to remediate those issues straight away. So if we look at the events raised, 49% of the events that we're raising with our customers are actually false positives. And that seems like a very concerning stat, really, doesn't it? Because we go to security technologies with the view that we reduce the amount of false positives. Data is a little bit biased towards the fact that we've actually been bringing on quite a few customers in 2018. And so when organizations first come on board with any sort of security service or even technology, you spend a good proportion of the first few months trying to tune out the noise, all those things that you don't expect to see. Technologies can't be built for out of the box to work with every single environment. Every environment is different, so you have to do a certain amount of tuning. So they would expect it to be a fair amount of tuning in there. Then we have a split between open events, of course, ongoing activities that we're investigating systems, and of course actions to be taken. But 29% where we've performed some form of action has meant that hundreds of potential breaches have been prevented, and that's ideally what you want to be doing, is spotting those attacks early, preventing them before they become a problem. And we are of course one of those organizations doing that investigation, but as an organization you'd be thinking about that yourself. How am I detecting these attacks? How could I potentially spot phishing campaigns as early on as possible? How can I be detecting attackers trying to compromise my websites? And of course, how do I identify attackers targeting my general infrastructure? Let's look at the detail of the events that we're looking at, and then it will become clear why we see a fair amount of false positives. And of course, you can use things like machine learning and other technologies to help address these things, but really today, the big focus for many organizations is how do I deal with these suspicious user activities? These are the things where you can't quite figure out whether it's an actual problem or not, because you can't guess what a user is doing at any one time, and users, of course, are not going to be operating the same way every day. They might come in late one day, they might work a few extra hours at the end of the day. How do we keep on top of that, and how do we identify whether this is a concern, something that needs to be raised or escalated? So suspicious activity is something we investigate a lot. It's 70% of our data type. The next down is email attacks. As we've seen, attackers are, of course, targeting our end users. They're using smart techniques. And the idea here is that we're monitoring email communications to identify if there's any chance that the attackers are trying to use that to compromise your end users. Of course, suspicious administrator activity has got to be up there high on our list of priorities, because at the stage of a suspicious user, there's still the need for the attacker to maybe escalate privileges to be able to do and perform their attack. When you're down at the administrator level, the administrators have got permissions to do a lot of different things. So priority around what does a normal administrator activity look like is really critical. What hours do they operate? What functions are they doing on a normal basis? Where is that anomalous activity? And then, of course, in there is, of course, application attacks and, of course, external network attacks. The things you expect. The attackers are targeting our perimeter. We're seeing more and more attacks against web applications because we're building more web apps and we're releasing more applications. So the attackers, of course, target what they have access to. So let's have a look at the suspicious user activity. What could happen next? Well, the first thing, of course, the attacker might be trying to do is escalate privileges. So trying to link that user with privilege escalation is really critical, and try and spot where that user might suddenly have more permissions than you expect them to see. We want to be looking to see if that user is starting to do something with the data? Can we see them touching information and data they shouldn't be that could lead to data theft? And of course, also we're looking at what they're installing, because it could be that that user then goes on to install malware, in which case there's a good chance that that's an attacker that's managed to get access to one of your users through maybe a brute force attack or exploiting a system. The final last thing here is that if you've got suspicious users doing something on your network, there may be a situation where they land downtime or outage on your network. And again, you want to try and prevent that as early as possible. So I said false positives are inevitable, and why? Some part, as I mentioned, a good proportion of the time that you're building your systems and looking at security, you want to make sure you tune out all the noise so that you can spot those needles in the needle stack, those big priority items that you need to go and investigate as early on as possible. But false positives are actually really useful, because the first thing they help us to do is really fine-tune our detection systems. They allow us to spot those anomalies where our detection capability may be lacking. We might need to improve that by adding new features or functionality or tuning. And of course, the other thing is it might help us to actually improve the security through helping to teach the machine learning algorithms how to do a better job. Now, of course, many vendors out there are saying you can just turn machine learning on these days and it will do user behavioral analysis and all that good stuff. In my experience, almost all of these cases, you still need somebody to help to teach these machines what's right and what's wrong. And that leads to us continually helping to improve by telling it where it's got something wrong. One of the other things it does also do with false positives, it demonstrates that we really care, because if we're looking at false positives and we're escalating them, there's a good chance that there's something suspicious there. It does rely on your techies, your security experts, really knowing what they're looking at as to not raise overly too many false positives, but of course the key thing here is that it still needs people to investigate those threats and to try and help decide whether they are really false positives or not. So what does this mean for modern monitoring technologies? What is the challenge for monitoring? With the modern SIEM technologies, the first thing that they really need to be able to address is this change in the way we work. We are now much more agile. We're now scaling more. We're growing. We're able to grow our systems much faster. We've got the speed and scalability. And in a lot of cases, proactive monitoring technologies weren't originally designed to be able to handle this. They weren't built for technologies like containers and Kubernetes and Docker and all these sorts of things. They were more focused on very static systems. So that's the first challenge technologies have had to overcome more recently, and of course continue to need to be able to address. The other thing is we've seen organizations build more and more web applications and start to use more API technologies. And of course, we're now putting things into public cloud environments. Technologies have had to follow suit. The ability to be able to pull information, useful security events from all of these different assets. And that's a very different challenge that hasn't been, many technologies haven't been able to address previously. So these cloud-based technologies, a lot of cases, is not just about monitoring what you're building, it's also about what you could be doing wrong when you're building out these cloud technologies. And in a lot of cases, we're just trialing them at the moment with things like Kubernetes and Docker and a lot of these other technologies. We've seen attackers starting to target them because, of course, as we're building out these systems to test them, we're not really focused on security again. We don't necessarily know enough about these technologies to be able to protect them. So more recently, there was a vulnerability that was brought to the attention of the security industry where they'd found vulnerabilities in Docker Community Edition, because what organizations were doing is running up a community edition version of Docker, testing out how it works, leaving them out on the internet, exposed to attackers. And of course, attackers found vulnerabilities and started using those systems, spinning up servers, running miners on those servers, using them for their attacks, all sorts of stuff. And again, it just comes down to lack of knowledge, really, and lack of knowledge of these emerging technologies and what we need to do to protect them. And so we really need to get better at sharing information and getting knowledge of how to protect these systems, and of course getting expertise in that ability and capturing that information to be able to detect it as early as possible. And the last thing, of course, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the times we're relying on these third parties, these businesses that we are going to provide us with additional functionality and features, and we're having to relinquish a certain amount of control with these applications, these systems we're building, because we're maybe putting it into cloud environments where we're relying on the security of the third party. The key thing here is to remember that you've got to understand where the responsibility model is. What is the third party responsible for? What are you responsible for? Then you can really understand what you need to do to protect these systems and what is on the responsibility of a third party. So with that, I'm going to cover off a few conclusions. So to start with, I wanted to talk about compliance for a bit, because can compliance really change security? It's having a good try. Many of the technologies and security solutions that are out there today have really been grown through compliance, right? Compliance has driven the need to have certain security controls and doing them more regularly, like penetration testing, doing them more regularly, doing vulnerability scanning more regularly, doing daily log reviews, for example. A lot of the compliance requirements are driving that need. We're also seeing that things like GDPR has actually helped organizations to get security funding, the ability to invest in security and policies and procedures, because these fines are, of course, driving organizations to think differently about how they secure their systems and how they protect customers' data, which is really important when you look at these big stats of all these breaches. We really do want organizations to think about how we protect our customers' data and how we deal with even our own employees, how we protect their data. Of course, the lack of patching often has been driven by the fact that these organizations are now having to do something about it, because it's part of your compliance requirement to be thinking about patching systems to be more secure. I guess the question is whether we're taking compliance seriously, and really security should be our first strategy. Let's go and secure our systems and think about security, because compliance really will come along on that journey with you if you've done the right things around security and implemented good practice. Unfortunately, in some cases, the fines are actually cheaper than organizations doing this remediation. If you've got a large infrastructure with lots and lots of software that you've got to patch or systems you've got to upgrade, unfortunately, it leads to the situation where some organizations may just say, it's actually cheaper for me to actually take the fines on rather than try and fix these systems, which is, of course, a big concern for all of us in the security space. And the last part, of course, is that many organizations have a steep technical debt. They've invested a lot of money into technologies. They might not be getting the full value out of the security technologies they've already invested in, which gives them a bad taste in their mouth. There also are situations where they've invested lots of money in very expensive software that now they want to get the value out of, and unfortunately, in some cases, they can't patch them, they can't update them. And sometimes that's a barrier, a considerable barrier to remediation if you've got too much technical debt. Now, I want to give you an interesting one here that we've come across a few times and we hear people talking about all the time. And we've sort of coined the term, we've given it the name skeleton scare. It's essentially a play on words really between skeletons in your closet and being scared into doing something, essentially paying some money. Essentially, the attackers are starting to send emails. So they're taking these databases of breaches, they're finding these user credentials of users' email addresses and their passwords, and they're using them to their advantage. I mentioned this at the beginning of the presentation. Essentially, they're sending emails very much like this, where it essentially looks like they've managed to compromise your system. They will release a password a password of yours. It will generally come from one of these big data breaches where a password and username has been released or leaked. So it will be your email address typically with a password that you'll be familiar with, and you'll be thinking, how could they possibly know my password? Which then tricks you into thinking, well, maybe they have hacked my machine. And it will say things in here like, we've been watching the videos you're looking at, they're pretty damning, I've installed some Trojan that's enabled me to get access to your system, and I'm doing key logging, and I've turned on your webcam, and all this sort of stuff, which starts to scare people into thinking, well, maybe they do have my data, and what are they going to do with it? And then they go and ask you to pay them some money, and they put it into a cryptocurrency. So they'll get you to pay some Bitcoin. So pretty concerning. Essentially, it's just spam. It preys on the user's guilt and conscience. It normally makes use of some information that is very difficult for somebody to get ordinarily, taken from previous breaches. The password is really used to authenticate the attack, to make it feel like it's really authentic and they actually do hack your systems. But in reality, they really don't. So what next, really, in that case? What's the future of skeleton scare? The most breaches that occur, the more breaches that occur, the more likely are the more information they have, which makes their backstory a lot more credible. It's likely that they will start to tailor it more, so tailor it and refine their attack to tailor it more to the individuals. If they are really smart, they'll start using things like AI and machine learning to scour data from other assets like on the internet or other sources and try and make that message even more relevant to you as an individual. So what are we expecting to see in 2019? What's the future look like? If you want to keep up to date with what's going to be, what's coming, keep an eye on our Twitter feed. It's down there in the bottom left-hand corner there. We like to provide updates to our customers, and we'll continue to provide interesting articles and information that we provide on a regular basis. But we expect to see more card skimming in the report itself, which is going to be released in January. So if you're watching a recording of this, the report will likely already be out on our website. Go and download it. We talk specifically about some card skimming techniques. So attackers are still trying to get your credit card information. We expect to see more and more Internet of Things devices being attacked in more unique and innovative ways. There's a good chance we're going to continue to see out-of-date software being part of these big breaches, and organizations' pen testing results are likely to still come back in further years into our 2020 report, which will again touch on that, I'm sure. And skeleton scare, I'm sure it's not gone away. I think the more and more we see attackers compromising systems, the more data they'll have, the better these attacks will get, and the more relevant they'll get, and the more likely they are to have information about you that could actually lead to them actually doing more targeted attacks against individuals. At the moment, it's very blanket attacks, very opportunistic, because they've got a database of billions of users, and going through every single one of those users and making it all very relevant is very difficult unless you are using things like more advanced AI technologies to make these scams more relevant. And so, top tips from Bulletproof. Let's finish up on a few top tips. So first thing, of course, look to keep your software up to date. That's what the attackers are targeting. So if you're not keeping them up to date, you're a target. Think about proactively hardening systems. So when you're monitoring your environments, look at what you can do to proactively protect those systems. Focus on the outcomes. Often people just focus on those alerts and they don't think about the overall outcome of the threat. What could it actually lead to if the attacker was successful? Educate, especially around the social engineering side of things. Say no to unsolicited emails. Don't follow links. Perform regular testing, so regular penetration testing, and also more regular automated testing helps you to keep on top of these patches and top of these threats. Non-admin users, so anybody who's an admin user, make sure they're not using their admin rights for their everyday work. Make sure you're enforcing strong passwords, policies. Maintain a risk register, so you know what you've got in your environment, where are the most risky assets, because it enables you to identify where the attackers might target. And of course, test things like your incident response plan, because if you don't know how to protect yourself and triage yourself from an incident, it's going to be very difficult when you do actually have to deal with it and you're under pressure to remediate it. And of course, monitor your critical files, because if you see attackers dropping files into certain systems or touching files they shouldn't, there's a good chance that they're already on your systems and they're trying to do more with your systems. So in summary, attackers, we haven't seen them really changing much since the beginning of time when from the security side of things. We haven't really seen them changing their approach. They're still doing the same attacks. They're not changing the way they're attacking systems. It's just they're adding slightly new techniques. They're still targeting the same things: applications, users, and of course unpatched systems. It's the environments that are changing, not the hackers' methods. Better security practice continues to be the biggest risk to organizations. If you're not looking at your systems and you've got bad security practices in there, the attackers will benefit from it and they will use that to their advantage. And as long as criminals can monetize a breach, they're going to continue to do this and to continue to try and target systems. Thanks very much for listening, and we look forward to seeing you on our next webinar.